What up, y'all? It's Mr. Miniman. We're talking about analyzing literature. And today, we're going to talk about how to track character development. And to do that, we're going to be thinking back to a book we all read, Of Mice and Men. So we're going to talk about how John Steinbeck introduced character and how he developed those characters as the book went on. First, and this might seem obvious, but you want to pay attention to the way the author introduces the character. In Of Mice and Men, you might remember that Lenny and George both come down from the road, and the way Steinbeck describes both of them really gives you an idea of who the character is and how they're related to each other in this case. And one thing we can pay close attention to is the use of adjectives, those describing words. So some of the words he uses in that opening passage for George are small, quick, sharp. So especially a word like sharp gives you an idea of his intelligence. Quick gives you an idea of quick thinking. With Lenny, we know he's huge, but by calling him shapeless, you get an idea that he is just his personality is weaker than George's. George has a very strong personality. Lenny is not a strong personality. He needs George to tell him what to do. So just in the opening passage, through those adjectives, you get an idea of each character. Another way you can track character development is to see the character get into a difficult situation and see how they respond early in the book. So for instance, in Of Mice and Men, George and Lenny have to get a job. So George goes to the boss of the ranch and he tells Lenny not to talk, and George handles everything himself. That tells you a couple things. First, if you didn't pick up on it already, you get the impression that George is a leader. He likes to take charge. Two, you learn that he also understands how to navigate social interactions with other people, because he tells Lenny to be quiet and he handles it himself and he does a good job. So he understands things. He knows how to get what he wants when he talks to other people. Lenny, on the other hand, lacks social understanding. He doesn't understand how to navigate these situations, so George tells him to be quiet. And when Lenny finally giggles at something he shouldn't have, that tells you he doesn't know how to handle situations like this. So by watching this scene where they're both in a difficult situation where they need to accomplish something, their actions tell you about what kind of character they are. Another thing you can look at is, does the author present any weaknesses in the character early in the book? The best characters in literature are not perfect. They have flaws. They have weaknesses. So when you are reading a book, pay attention to what weaknesses the author might subtly be showing you in the character, because those weaknesses will often turn into strengths by the end of the book. The character will develop and learn and change. Or they might not. In the case of Mice and Men, a weakness presented early on is that Lenny doesn't know his own strength. We find that out in chapter 1 when George talks about how Lenny always kills the mice he pets. Lenny never learns how to harness that strength and not harm things. And because he doesn't learn from that weakness, tragically he dies. But that weakness was established in chapter 1 by Steinbeck. And it's that weakness that forms an important part of Lenny's character. George, on the other hand, in chapter 1, we see that he is quick to anger with Lenny. And he treats Lenny poorly. He's frustrated. It's understandable, but he is quick to anger. In chapter 6, he tells Lenny that he's never been angry with him, which is his way of telling Lenny that he loves him. But that wouldn't have the same impact in chapter 6 if Steinbeck hadn't set it up in chapter 1. So the way he presents weaknesses in characters early on in the book will have ramifications throughout the book. Another important way of analyzing a character is to look at their primary motivations and what those motivations say about that person. In chapter 1, we see Lenny's primary motivation is mainly to have something to pet and to follow George around. So immediately we view him as almost a child. George, on the other hand, is different. He has to be concerned about money, shelter, food, all those adult responsibilities. Those motivations are set up in chapter 1, and they continue throughout the book. And one of George's responsibilities is to take care of Lenny. And that's what he does, even at the very end. And finally, another way to analyze character is to look at how other characters respond to that primary character you're analyzing. Sometimes, if a book is in first person, for instance, the author won't have the character describe themselves. You have to kind of figure out what they're like based on the way that other characters treat them. Of Mice and Men, of course, is third person. So we actually see other characters respond to them. And we can think back to that scene with the boss again. The way the boss treats Lenny, he's very suspicious of Lenny. He questions whether George is taking advantage of Lenny. He can tell that there's something wrong with Lenny. So in case the reader hadn't picked up on that by now, the boss's reaction to Lenny tells the reader that Lenny has some mental weaknesses. George, on the other hand, although the boss does question George somewhat, George is able to convince the boss, and the boss eventually goes along with all the things George says. So that tells us that George is smart. He understands how to interact with people in a way that will get him the things he needs. And all that comes from the way the boss responds to Lenny and George. So, as you read any literary narrative book, you can use these methods to analyze how an author is developing a character, and you can track the character's development throughout the book. Thanks for listening. Goodbye. Mindeman out.